Hello and welcome back to the Consider the Coelc YouTube channel. On today's video we're going to be continuing our lecture series What It Means to Be a Lutheran by continuing through the Augsburg Confession with Article 16 on the civil realm and the secular government. This article is essentially broken into two sections. The first section establishes the foundational principle for Lutherans regarding government and the civil realm, and specifically condemns the error of the Anabaptists. The second section then focuses in on the error of Roman monasticism and its rejection of participation in the civil realm. So let us first take a look at the first section, which addresses civil obedience, political office, the judicial system, capital punishment warfare, the economy, taking of oaths, private property, and also marriage. So regarding the first point of civil obedience, the Lutherans had been accused by Johann Eck in his 404 Articles for the Diet of Augsburg of being anarchists, anti-government, and revolutionaries. Eck had conflated all the Protestants together, and thus the Lutherans had been equated with the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists, like their modern successors, the Amish and Mennonites, believe that in order for Christians to not be of the world, they need to be completely separated from the world. The Anabaptists would then form their own sectarian communes where they were considered a law unto themselves. Eck had quoted Luther as saying, "We Christians are free, exempt from all the laws of men, liberated through baptism," and thus Eck used this as a proof text that Luther was an anarchist. Luther, however, believed in civil obedience and discusses the topic at length in the Large Catechism when discussing the fourth commandment. The quote from Luther is not encouraging revolutionary or anarchical behavior, but this is typical hyperbole quoted from Luther, who is just expressing the freedom that we Christians have via being justified by grace alone through faith alone. In the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, Melanchthon declares that the gospel does not destroy the state or the household, but rather approves them, and that Christians are commanded by God to obey the government, and here Melanchthon quotes Romans 13:1, which calls on Christians to be subject to their governing authorities. Melanchthon also states that we are to follow the present laws of the land, whether formulated by pagans or others. He then criticizes their former colleague Andreas Karlstadt as insane for trying to impose the Mosaic civil laws on the Christians. The critique from Melanchthon references a former dispute between Luther and Karlstadt, in which Karlstadt insisted that Christians were bound to follow the Mosaic civil laws, a position that Luther rejected in his 1525 Against the Heavenly Prophets. Therefore, as Christians, we are to submit to the present laws of our current government. However, the confessions do teach that this is to be done insofar as it can be done without sinning. In the Augsburg Confession, Melanchthon references Acts 5:29, obey God rather than man, declaring that if a command of the political authority cannot be followed without sin, we must obey God rather than any human being. Therefore, if the government would compel us to do something sinful or prohibits us from doing something that God commands us to do, then we must obey God rather than man. But if the laws can be followed without sinning, then we are bound by the fourth commandment to obey both God and man. The next point of discussion is the political office. The Anabaptists taught that Christians were forbidden from holding any political office. The Lutherans, however, taught that Christians may exercise authorities, be princes or judges, or hold any political office as long as they can do so without sinning. For example, in the Soviet Union or USSR, their governmental positions required a denial of Christ and any religious affiliation. Thus, a Christian could not hold an office that requires them to denounce Christ or to perform any other sin. But as long as their office was not sinful, then Christians could be free to hold it. This is most evident by the fact that in the Old Testament, it is full of believing kings, And also, the prophet Daniel also held the position of Rabmag, or chief wise man, under the Babylonian Empire. The Anabaptists could argue that this was only in the Old Testament and that New Testament Christians were forbidden from serving in governmental positions. But what about the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8 who is said to have served in the court of Queen Candace? There is no prohibition in Scripture that would restrict Christians from serving in a governmental position. As Melanchthon said, God permits us to make use of political office and laws, just as he permits us to use medicine, architecture, food, drink, and air. The next point of discussion is the judicial system. Eck had accused Luther of denying the judicial system because Luther had once said, "All are heathen who contend in court for property or reputation, and again, if anything be taken from us, we ought not to demand it back in court or by war." But this is a deliberate misinterpretation by Eck. Luther didn't say that Christians can't use the judicial system. As Melanchthon says, we can make use of these things just as we make use of medicine. In fact, in the Apology, Melanchthon declares that Christians are forbidden by the gospel to seek out redress or revenge. In proof of this, he references Matthew 5:39, turn the other cheek, and Romans 12:19, never avenge yourself, for vengeance belongs to the Lord. Instead, Melanchthon says, according to Romans 13, we are to seek justice through the judicial system. We are not to take the law into our own hands, but are instead to go through the proper legal and judicial process. And we Christians are permitted to make use of this system. Luther's comment about not contending in court is not a prohibition against the judicial system, but it's that Christians should be willing to turn the other cheek and not seek personal gain. We should be more concerned with the needs of our neighbour than with our own wants. Additionally, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6 verses 1 to 8, Christian brethren should be able to sort out matters peaceably outside of court without having to get lawyers and judges involved. Luther's point is that Christians shouldn't need to go to court. Pagans and unbelievers who seek their own benefit, they go to court. But those of us who are compelled by Christian love for their neighbour, we need not waste time with these legal proceedings. The next point of discussion is capital punishment. As early as Genesis 9:6, God decreed that if anyone sheds the blood of man, then by men shall their blood be shed. The Mosaic civil law decreed the death penalty for a number of crimes. And in Romans 13:4, it declares that the government has the God-given right and responsibility to wield the sword for the sake of curbing wickedness and protecting the innocent. Therefore, the government can and should punish evildoers, whether this be by death penalty, exile, or imprisonment. Although the Lutherans do stress that the government are to enact just punishments, and that this is to be done without sin. Therefore, we must draw a distinction between capital punishment and state-sanctioned murder. For example, the government can execute criminals for their crimes. The Bible does not provide a clear guideline regarding capital punishment and the severity of a crime, although we could imply certain limits based on the Mosaic law. Therefore, a government could enact a death penalty for a severe crime, such as mass murder, or even for a lesser crime, such as drug trafficking, as is the case in countries like Indonesia. In the Mosaic law, things like adultery and homosexuality were punishable by death. As is, I think, now in the country of Nigeria, or... don't quote me, there is an African country that's recently brought in the death penalty for homosexuality. I think it's Nigeria, but don't quote me on it because I've, for this point in time, blanked on which exact country that is. Point being, there are times when homosexuality was punishable by death. In these cases, however, the criminal is put to death for the crime they have committed. So when we say death penalty homosexuality, it wasn't for just having homosexual thoughts or tendencies, it was for like actually committing the act of sodomy and homosexual intercourse. The government does have the right and the responsibility to punish evildoers, but they do not possess the right to punish non-criminals. Here I am not referring to the execution of those who are falsely accused, because in such a case, even though the person may have been wrongly convicted, the reason for their execution is still the conviction of a crime. What I'm talking about here is when the government murders people for non-crimes. For example, during the Holocaust, when the Nazis murdered Jews simply because of their Jewish ethnicity. Being born of a certain race or ethnicity is not a crime, and thus the government does not possess the right to execute people based on their race. Such practices should be opposed by Christians. Likewise, it goes in the case of abortion, in which the government permits the murder of the unborn. Being conceived is not a crime, and thus the government does not have the right to legalize abortion, and thus Christians should oppose it. The next point of discussion is warfare. Romans 13 grants the government the right and responsibility to bear the sword. This is done both internally to protect our citizens and externally to protect us from other countries. Here we must discuss 2 points. Firstly, are Christians permitted to serve in the military? And secondly, are Christian governments permitted to engage in warfare? Luther addressed these issues in 1523 in his writing on temporal authority, and in 1526 in his writing Whether Soldiers Too Can Be Saved. Melanchthon also states in the Confession that Christians are permitted to serve in the military and to engage in just warfare. The Anabaptists condemned this, and Amish and Mennonites still to this day take a pacifist stance and object to conscription. One of the proof texts for such pacifism comes from Matthew 26:52, in which Jesus tells Peter to put down his sword, for whoever lives by the sword dies by the sword. But this is not actually a proof text for pacifism. This is not a proof text for pacifism and Christians being forbidden from military service. Instead, Jesus is teaching that if you exercise the sword, you are to do so in the appropriate office. Peter does not have the authority to wield the sword, for he was not a soldier. In Luke 3:14, soldiers came to John the Baptist and they asked what they should do. He did not tell them to leave the military, but he exhorted them to do so without threats or false accusations, but to be content with their wages. Here, John expressly tells soldiers to continue in their career, but that they should just simply be happy with what they get paid for. John does not tell the soldiers to leave the military, but to serve in the military in a Christian way. And I would add that this is a military run by a pagan Roman government. Likewise, when Jesus heals the centurion's servant, he does not tell the centurion to leave the ministry, nor does Peter tell Cornelius to leave the military after his conversion, and likewise Paul does not instruct the Philippian jailer, which is essentially part of the police force, to leave his position after conversion. Christians may rightly serve in the military, and soldiers are also permitted to kill and take lives in service of the military. Because they serve in a vocation in which the sword is being used to punish evildoers, they are allowed to take lives, and this then leads to discussion on just warfare. The Lutheran confessions teach that Christians may engage in just wars. Thus, this raises the question as to what is a just war. Well, first and foremost, Romans 13 declares that governments are to use the sword to curb wickedness and to protect the innocent. Thus, a war should be declared not for the sake of mere territorial or financial gain, but to defeat evildoers and to defend the innocent. In Luther's writings, he also establishes several other principles for the making of a just war. Luther also divides wars into 3 categories. There are inferiors versus superiors, wars amongst equals and superiors versus inferiors. Regarding the first situation of inferiors fighting against superiors, that is, when a small nation fights against a much larger nation, Luther held that this is never a just war. Luther taught that a just war is one that needs to be able to be won. A suicidal assault from a smaller nation against a much larger nation, which will only result in the death of many, many citizens and never result in victory, is not a just war. Obviously, little nations should not go picking fights with more powerful nations. But Luther said even if the larger nation started the fight, then the smaller nation should seek to sue for peace and preserve the lives of its citizens rather than fight a war that cannot be won. Luther held that Christians in this situation need to be able to bear the cross and to pray to God, waiting for God to bring justice. If possible, then they should flee, for Christians are instructed to flee from such persecution. Presumably, smaller nations can make pleas to larger nations for assistance, but as Luther taught, if the war cannot be won, then the government has the responsibility to surrender and to preserve as many lives as possible rather than to waste lives for an impossible victory. Now, regarding war amongst equals, in which victory is possible, Luther established several principles for a just war. Firstly, Luther draws a distinction between wars of desire and wars of necessity. The former he calls of the devil. Wars should not be fought for territorial or financial gain, or for glory or for revenge. Luther considered war as a necessary evil. He states that in order for one to go to war, they should first think, I love my neighbor and would prefer not to fight them, but for the sake of necessity, I am compelled to have to fight them. Next, Luther teaches that war should only be fought for the preservation of peace, to protect the innocent and to defeat evil. Therefore, a war should either be fought out of self-defense or because it is necessary to invade to prevent a greater evil from occurring. Concerning self-defense, Luther wrote regarding the Turks, or the Ottoman Empire, that if times were different, he would rather prefer to leave them alone. Luther desired a policy of, you leave us alone and we'll leave you alone. However, since the Turks kept attacking Europe, then the Europeans had no option but to fight back and to invade the Ottoman Empire. Concerning the prevention of a greater evil, Luther wrote that the government wielded the sword to curb wickedness. Therefore, one must ask himself, is it profitable to suffer a small lack of peace now in order to avoid a greater lack of peace in the future? We can also add to this list the curbing of wicked leaders or regimes. The government is to wield the sword to curb wickedness. Therefore, if we know that another nation is committing great acts of evil, then governments may engage in warfare to keep evil out of their country, or they may invade other countries to prevent evil from happening there. For example, consider the Spanish conquests of South America, in which they were done in the name of eradicating the pagan practice of human sacrifice. Now, regarding wars between superiors and inferiors, Luther held that stronger powers should not use their might to oppress weaker nations. Luther taught that a superior should only invade an inferior if necessary. For example, if a smaller nation is stirring up trouble and needs to be put down quickly before things get out of hand. Essentially, stronger nations need to protect weaker nations and they should only serve as peacekeepers. Lastly, Luther addresses the issue of soldiers fighting in wars that might be unjust. Here, Luther states that you need to do what is right within your vocation. Therefore, do not do something that is sinful as a soldier. However, regarding whether the war was just or unjust, That responsibility falls not on the individual soldiers, but on the leaders who are declaring the wars. It may be unjust for this nation to invade that nation, but a soldier, it is simply your duty to do what you're commanded to do. If the war was unjust, then you should leave it to God to bring about true justice. Now, as Willard Albeck wrote in his studies in the Lutheran Confessions, every government asserts that it acts and its policies are lawful and just. The individual Christian rarely is in a position to have all the facts. And when his nation is at war, his judgment is biased. The brutal fact is that the Christian citizen must conform to laws which provide at best only a rough justice. The reality is that in some cases, neither side is actually just. And in some cases, maybe both sides are justified in the war. It would be great if people could just sit down and work things out peaceably. But this sadly is not the reality of this fallen world. And as a soldier, you simply follow your orders and pray to God that you are on the right side. With that said, Luther does also teach that the government does not have jurisdiction over soul and conscience. And the confessions do teach us to serve insofar as we can do so without sinning. Thus, if one truly thinks that their government is doing something wicked and that the war that they are engaged in is not justifiable, then we must obey God rather than man, and we need to object. Now, the next point of discussion is the economy. Some radical reforming groups held that Christians were not to possess private property or to engage in buying and selling. The Lutherans strongly reject this as just simply nonsense. And the next point of discussion in this article is the taking of oaths. The Anabaptists considered oath-taking to be sinful. The Lutheran confessions teach that one may take oaths without sinning. Luther discusses this in his large catechism regarding the second commandment and swearing. Jesus warned us not to swear by heaven or by earth or by Jerusalem or by ourselves. Instead, let our yes be yes and our no be no. James 5:12 speaks of this, saying that we should not swear lest we fall under condemnation. However, the Bible is full of examples of people swearing oaths. In Matthew 26 verses 63 and 64, Jesus under oath answered the chief priests about his true identity. In Galatians 1:20 and 2 Corinthians 1:23, Paul swears an oath that he is speaking the truth. Thus, Luther says in the Large Catechism, since we are forbidden here to use his holy name in support of falsehoods and wickedness, it follows conversely that we are commanded to use it in the service of truth and all that is good. For example, when we swear properly, when it is necessary and required. When we swear by God's name to uphold the truth, such as when we say in court, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God, or when we swear an oath as part of a marriage vow, or when one takes an oath as part of their entry into an office, all of these are appropriate swearing of oaths. Now, the next point of discussion is private property. This point was focused less at Anabaptists who did not permit private property and more at the monastic orders. Rome held that in order to obtain perfect righteousness, one had to take a vow of poverty and to relinquish all private property. Monastic orders would live in communes and own no personal items. The Lutherans rejected this as such an idea as nonsense. Firstly, because one cannot earn righteousness before God by simply giving up their property. And secondly, Christians have a right to private property. In the Apology, Melanchthon points out that Abraham, David, and Daniel all had great wealth, yet they were no less holy than a hermit. Melanchthon points out that the seventh commandment, you shall not steal, recognizes the right of ownership and that each person should have their own property. He then criticizes John Wycliffe, who taught that priests were not allowed to own property. From here we can deduce that communism, in which the government or nation owns all property and the individual is not permitted to own anything, is a sin and a violation of the seventh commandment. Now, some socialist-minded Christians like to point to the Book of Acts where it says everyone had everything in common, and they use this as a proof of communism. But there is a difference between Christians voluntarily giving up their property versus the government confiscating your property and mandating that you cannot own private property. As Herman Susser wrote, Christianity says what is mine is now thine, whereas communism says what is thine is now mine. In Acts 5, Ananias and Sapphira surrendered their property to the commune, but they secretly kept some for themselves. When they were rebuked by St. Peter for doing this, he does not condemn them for having private property, but he condemns them for lying. Peter says that if they had sold their property, it remained theirs, and that if they had sold, they reserved the right. Peter says that if they did not sell their property, it remained theirs, and that once they had sold the property, they reserved the right to do with it as they please. They did not sin by having private property. They sinned by lying to the commune and seeking to have their own wealth plus the wealth of the commune. See, groups and even nations can voluntarily enter into a community of sharing property, but no one is to be forced to surrender their private property, nor should they be forced to join the group or to stay in the group. If a nation, for whatever reason, wants to become communist, they do have that right. But they don't have the right to take from people their private property, and if people want to take their private property and leave that nation, then they have the right to do so as well. Now, the next point of discussion is marriage. In the Augsburg Confession, the Lutherans were specifically addressing the Roman era of clerical and monastic celibacy. If monks or nuns chose to remain celibate, this does not make them any more holy. Likewise, clergy should not be forbidden from marriage. Another interesting point is that the Lutheran understanding of marriage is that it belongs to the state and not to the church. In Article 2829 of the Augsburg Confession, Melanchthon teaches that the power and jurisdiction of bishops over marriage is only by human right, and that where bishops fail, the power reverts to the state. This understanding about marriage stems from two teachings. One is that the approval and acknowledgement of marriage is the responsibility of the parents, not the church, and the other is that the government is an extension of the office of parent. In the book of Genesis, it was the parents who arranged marriages and made the official declaration that a couple was now pronounced married. In the ancient world, before the days of marriage certificates and the legal paperwork, it was the parents and the families that declared a marriage to be official. A rabbi or a priest may conduct the ceremony and the church blessing, but the legal recognition of marriage was the duty of the parents and the wider family community. These days, some Christians claim to be married in the eyes of God and not in the eyes of the state. But such a concept is foreign to Scripture. In John 4, Jesus, who is God, speaks with a Samaritan woman who is currently cohabitating with a man. Jesus declares to her that the man that she is now with is not her husband. Thus, she is not married in the eyes of God. Scripturally speaking, marriage requires public acknowledgement. Therefore, in order to be married in the eyes of God, one must also be married in the eyes of the state. Now, of course, there is always the exception to the rule, and that is where the government is wicked and where the Christian must obey God rather than man. For example, if the government outlawed interracial marriage, the Bible does not prohibit interracial marriage, and it is not a sin to belong to a different ethnicity. Therefore, in such a case, Christians could marry in spite of the governmental laws. However, in this case, the duty to declare the marriage official would revert back to the responsibility of the parents. With all that said, the Lutherans declare that Christians may engage in politics, warfare, economy, marriage, as long as we can do so without sinning. We reject the error of the Anabaptists who say that that it is a sin to engage in politics or warfare. We also reject the error of the monastic orders who think that one can earn righteousness by abstaining from politics, warfare, economy, or marriage. We also oppose the errors of Karlstadt and others who taught that the Christians are bound to follow the Mosaic civil law. Instead, we teach that the Christian is bound by the fourth commandment to obey the laws of the land in which they live, and we are to subject ourselves to the government as long as they do not compel us to do something sinful or prohibit us from doing something that God has commanded us to do. We are to submit to our rulers and to pray for them, but where the laws of man conflict with the law of God, then we must obey God rather than man. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.